Is it time to stop worrying about accusations of Islamophobia? Ever since the 9/11 attacks, concerns about possible discrimination against Muslims have acted to largely prevent an open discussion about the way Islamists are waging a war on the West. But along with that has also come a reluctance to mention the way Islam has acted as an engine of anti-Semitism, both in the Middle East and the United States. But amid the surge of anti-Semitism since the Hamas-led Palestinian Arab terror attacks on Israel on October 7, 2023, the truth can no longer be covered up by political correctness or concerns about Islamophobia that have proved to be largely a way to silence any reporting or commentary about Muslim Jew hatred. Today, on Think Twice, we talk about the subject that no one seems to want to acknowledge with an author of a new book about a modern Qur'anic Kampf against the Jews. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with author Andrew Bostom about discussing his new book about the role of the Muslim Vatican in Cairo, Egypt, and its role in fomenting anti-Semitism. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Is it possible to discuss Muslim anti-Semitism without lapsing into irrational and mean-spirited prejudice? According to the liberal mainstream media and even most politicians, the answer is clearly no. In the decades since the 9/11 attacks, political leaders, journalists, and those who have run popular culture in the West have been far more afraid of inciting bias against innocent Muslims than they are in discussing the reality of widespread Islamist extremism, support for violence, and particularly the prevalence of anti-Semitic attitudes among adherents of Islam. All people and faiths deserve respect and ought not to be treated in a prejudicial way. And there is no excuse for discrimination against anyone on the basis of their faith or ethnic origin. But that does not obligate us to close our eyes and ears to the drumbeat of anti-Semitic incitement coming from the Muslim world, or to ignore the way that this has helped drive efforts to intimidate and even target Jews for violence. The failure to take note of these facts has been a significant part of the post-October 7th surge of anti-Semitism. What is at the bottom of this unfortunate trend? One answer is Islamic theology and the way it is interpreted by the faith's leading religious scholars, especially those at the Muslim Vatican, Hazr University in Cairo. One person who has explored the way that institution has helped promote and legitimize Jew hatred around the world is Andrew Bostom, who has made it his life's work to expose the truth about Islamist hate and has a new book out with a translation and commentary of a major Islamic text devoted to Jew hatred. Andrew Bostom is a former associate professor of medicine and researcher at Brown University Medical School. After the 9 attacks, he increasingly switched his focus to studying Islamic radicalism and has become a leading voice in discussing that subject, as well as a critic of COVID-19 policies. He is the author of the 2005 The Legacy of Jihad, Islamic Holy War and the Fate of Non-Muslims, the 2008 The Legacy of Islamic Antisemitism from Sacred Texts to Solemn History, the 2012 Sharia versus Freedom, The Legacy of Islamic Totalitarianism, the 2013 The Mufti's Islamic Jew Hatred, What the Nazis Learned from the Muslim Pope, and the 2014 Iran's Final Solution for Israel, The Legacy of Jihad and Shiite Islamic Jew Hatred in Iran, and now the new, A Modern Qur'anic Kampf Against the Jews. Dr. Andrew Bostom, welcome to Think Twice.
Thanks very much for having me, Jonathan.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Before we talk about your new book, I want to start by asking you about why it's so hard to talk about Muslim anti-Semitism and how prevalent it is. Is there reliable data that could inform our discussion of the subject that most people aren't familiar with?
Yeah, so the first part of your question, why is it so difficult? I think there's been a very successful effort to brand any discussion of aspects of Islam, Islamic societies that don't necessarily reflect so well on them as acts of Islamophobia. And I think this has been a very nefarious but sadly very effective campaign. And I think it quite literally frightens people in the media, certainly people in the academy. Um, and I think the only way to grapple with it is to speak in measured ways about data, for example, about the just extraordinarily disproportionate prevalence of what the ADL itself classifies as extreme anti-Semitism. In other words, just very simply, Jonathan, the ADL has come up with a quite well-validated scale where they simply confront the respondent with 11 anti-Semitic stereotypes. And if the respondent agrees with at least 6 of them, they can agree with all 11, but they agree with at least 6, then they become an index case of extreme anti-Semitism, which I think is a reasonable definition. And then ADL simply tallies the prevalence of this degree of anti-Semitism within countries, within different ethnic groups within countries. And the data are quite disturbing. So disturbing as you know, because we had a whole debate at the JNS, that sometimes the ADL sees fit, for example, to suppress some of the data, particularly for Western Europe and the United States. But in other words, if we look at the ADL's global survey, and they did one in 2014, and then they repeated it 10 years later in 2024. And if anything, the results, which were disturbing in 2014, got a little more disturbing in 2024. Namely, that I think it was in 2014, the 16 most anti-Semitic countries in the world were all Muslim societies, where the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism was roughly from 70 to 90 plus percent. The more recent data from 2024 expanded that list to 19 of these 19 most anti-Semitic countries in the world, and there the prevalence, the number's a little sharper in my mind, so was 64% to 97%. And what was shocking was that Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, and had for many years, for whether it was appropriate or not, had the reputation of being a more moderate country. This was non-Arab Islam, etc. It was some syncretism with Hinduism, other religions, Eastern religions. And there was at least a somewhat tolerated Christian minority population there. The prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism by the ADL's own survey in 2024 was now 96%. We have those data, international data.
That's bad enough, but what was the data that wasn't published?
Well, they were published for a while.
That's pretty bad. So
It
wasn't
the
published.
data that existed so there were the same instrument was applied to European countries, Western European countries, and they existed on the ADL's website from about 2015 to 2023, and what they showed was that the comparing Muslims to non-Muslim populations in Western Europe or Christian populations in Europe, we didn't see the levels of extreme anti-Semitism, in the Muslim populations that we saw in the Middle East and North Africa and some of these Asian countries. But we did see rates as high as 62%, for example, in France as of 2023. And what we also saw was that those rates were, and despite the long history of anti-Semitism in Western Europe, the non-Muslim populations who still harbored some of that anti-Semitism, their rates of anti-Semitism would be, typically maybe 15 to at maximum 25 to 30%, where the Muslim populations, would be 50 to 60%. And then even in the United States, John, and this was absolutely fascinating. I didn't even learn about these data until I stumbled across them in a rather esoteric, academic journal called Religions but they came from a very reliable source. The man who is now the acting chair of Judaic Studies at Indiana University, Gunther Jekeli. And what Gunther did, he sort of tucked it away inside a long paper about many different aspects of anti-Semitism, including polling data. And apparently, to my shock, in 2017, the ADL had done a very large survey in the United States, 3,600 general population, non-Muslims, and an oversample, a really significant oversample of 805 Muslims. And the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism, because Gunther was given the raw data by someone he knew at the ADL, which, again, the ADL has never published. And the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism amongst the 3,600 random sample Americans was 6%. So America is a much more philo-Semitic country. But the prevalence amongst Muslims in this country as of 2017, I can't imagine it's gotten any better, was already 38%. So it was over sixfold what you saw in non-Muslim Americans. And again, never published by the ADL. I would literally not have known about them had I not stumbled across this brief description in a paper that was about 40 pages long.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Before we jump in, a quick invitation. The 2026 JNS International Policy Summit is coming up this April. It will be held from April 15th through the 17th, once again at the Waldorf Astoria in Jerusalem. I'll be there, and I'll hope you'll join us too. You can visit jns-summit.org to register and see the speaker lineup. It's an exceptional group and well worth your time. I'll look forward to meeting you in Jerusalem this April. I guess the next question for you, Andrew, is, it's a word we hear a lot, sometimes paired, very often paired with anti-Semitism, not rarely appropriately, is Islamophobia. What is Islamophobia really, and how have Islamic radicals managed to convince virtually the entire political, journalistic, and cultural establishment in the West to think that to talk about the hate that they promote is somehow an expression of prejudice against Muslims?
Right. Well, first of all, there is a classic definition of Islamophobia long before the modern era. And it was actually a very respected and sacralized Muslim doctrine. If you look at the Quran and then you look at the elaboration of the doctrine of jihad, the idea, and this is repeated in multiple verses in the Quran, in the 8th surah, the 60th verse, and the 47th surah, the 4th verse, the idea of striking terror in the heart of the infidel to get them to submit. And the jurists went on to elaborate this. For example, the great Muslim jurist Ibn Khaldun, who was a polymath and considered by some the world's first sociologist, he had a very, very lucid, measured description of the fact that, and Muhammad himself said, I've been made victorious through terror in one of the canonical hadith. But from the Muslim perspective, it was a way to get infidel populations to submit, and in the first place, not necessarily lose so many jihadists, and even for the subjected populations, not to cause the extent of the carnage that would be caused if they resisted. Mm-hmm. So it has its place,
but in its current use, it's the opposite of that.
It's the opposite of that. Exactly. And look, there can be so-called hate crimes against Muslims. Just there can be against people for having other faiths, for having different sexual tendencies, et cetera. But I can tell you that in my own experience, even in this state, Jonathan, we had an infamous case now. I sort of casually now refer to the shot in the tuchus heard around the world, because we have Lexington here, the shot heard around the world. Mm-hmm. It was literally a ginned up hate crime in front of a mosque, which, by the way, a mosque in Providence, which, frequently I've documented this, has given some very, very anti-Semitic, anti-Christian sermons. But be that as it may, about 6 weeks after October 7th, there was an incident where a Muslim who comes down from Maine, from Lewiston, Maine, which has a significant Somali Muslim community, by the way, and he sells Muslim paraphernalia, and he goes to the mosque, and he was fired upon while in front of the mosque on one Friday. And all across the world, it became, not only in the United States, local newspapers, CNN, but across the world, it became an Islamophobic shooting hate crime. Well, the police department in Providence refused to call it that about up to a week later. And I got curious about it, and eventually, with the help of a lawyer and Public Records Act request, I got the police report. And it turns out the only suspect was in fact another Muslim, a recidivist criminal who had, including weapons charges and drug charges, the victim himself, and he was a victim at that point. Thank God he had a superficial flesh wound to his buttocks. That was it. He was in and out of the ER in about two hours. He had a long criminal record, and in fact had been convicted for a 20-year sentence for selling drugs, but got off for some reason with a 5-year sentence. So be that as it may, the crime turned out to be two Muslims involved in a shooting, probably having something to do with drugs, because I eventually got to speak to the investigating officer, who was also part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And it turns out it's a mosque that's known to have a lot of prison converts, etc. But the whole atmospherics, CARE ginned it up, local politicians ginned it up. There was even a House resolution in the Rhode Island legislature calling it an Islamophobic hate crime, and the legislature apologized to the mosque, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not saying that every incidence of quote-unquote Islamophobia is like this, but there are many that have been ginned up along these lines. And I think this was particularly in the atmosphere after October 7th. The idea was to, capture as many of these so-called incidents as possible, even if they were as factitious as this one was.
Those cases are outrageous, but I think a lot of what is called Islamophobia aren't incidents that are being ginned up, but just reporting and commentary about Muslim anti-Semitism. I mean, we've seen this. CARE certainly does this all the time. Yep. Where anybody who happens to notice, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the Muslim community, are called Islamophobes.
Yes, and I think there's a larger rubric under which that falls, which is the idea that non-Muslims, and again, this is a principle in Islamic law, particularly if you're living in a Muslim society, which these people were used to, is that Islam, in all its manifestations, is not to be criticized by non-Muslims. That is, I mean, classically that is Islamic blasphemy law, but it's that mentality is obviously persisting into our age.
Yeah, and I think it's part of this is an effort to impose blasphemy laws on the West. We've seen that more of that in Europe, but I think that's behind the effort to label any criticism of Muslim anti-Semitism as Islamophobic.
Well, it's actually broader, Jonathan. There is an alternative instrument called the Cairo Declaration, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Islam, and it's a Sharia-based instrument. And they've been pushing it at the UN since 1990. And you can see, the largest voting bloc in the UN is the Organization of Islamic Conference, now Cooperation. And they have been pushing this aggressively till now. It hasn't succeeded. But that would be the goal. In other words, you would have formal redefinition of things like blasphemy, if not exactly to the letter, but much more consistent with Islamic law, and even things like apostasy. Remember, the penalty, again, the draconian penalty, it's rarely enforced even in Muslim societies, for leaving Islam and converting to another religion or becoming an atheist is death. So it's disturbing to see this instrument still being considered at the UN, and basically would abrogate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and which is not the best instrument, but it would affect potentially our Bill of Rights, which is an outstanding document in terms of protecting basic freedoms.
Right. Well, let's talk about your latest book. What is it, and why was it important to translate and provide commentary on a volume of Muslim religious commentary that few Americans had ever even heard of?
Right. So I first became acquainted with this is late Grand Imam Muhammad Sayyed Tantawi, and he was the Grand Imam of Hazr University, which to this day, and certainly since the 13th century, since the Mamluk period in Egypt, when Egypt was the seat of the Caliphate, has been the most important Sunni Islamic religious teaching institution in the world, bar none. And its Grand Imams obviously are highly esteemed in the Muslim world, and interact with the non-Muslim world. And when Tantawi, so he served as Grand Imam from 1996 to 2010. And so I learned about him when my interest in Islam was sparked around the time of 9/11. And I was quite concerned about some statements that he made in public. And I learned about this PhD thesis and incorporated some extracts from it translated some extracts from it for my book, The Legacy of Islamic Antisemitism, which came out in 2008. And I realized over the years that it took a long time to get funding to translate the full work. And it's a massive work. It's 759 pages in Arabic. I realized that, I would always be criticized because, was it cherry picking sections of this long work. And so ultimately I did get a grant, and I found through a colleague at Boston College, one of his colleagues who was actually a Coptic Christian academic Arabic instructor, and he was perfect for the translation job because Tantawi's Arabic was his Arabic, an Egyptian dialect, and he eventually agreed. We got a grant to pay him to translate the entire work, and I have to tell you, Jonathan, at one point he had translated the introduction and the first 2 chapters, and he sent me, just a very depressed, plaintive note. He wasn't sure he could go on. He had never read anything so venomous in his life, and I begged him to please, stick with it, and he did. He completed the work, and interestingly, we decided to translate not the 1968 version, the original version that came out. So Tantawi defended his thesis in 1966, but it wasn't published in those days. Publication was slower till 1968. He reissued it. Tantawi reissued it in 1997, so a year after he became Grand Imam, and it allowed us to see his very brief reintroduction to this 1968 publication, where he reaffirmed everything that was in it as Grand Imam. And this we felt was very important to include, because around the same time, it was more indirect evidence of his sentiments. He actually had an interaction with then Chief Rabbi of Israel Meir Lau. And it was reported in the press, and Memory did a fantastic job translating all the different reports. And it turned out then Tantawi had also reaffirmed the PhD thesis at that time, but this was confirmatory proof that in other words he had not mellowed over the 30 years. And in fact, he had also in that interim period produced a full Qur'anic commentary, at least edited it, of over 10 volumes. And I was able to look at many verses in that full Quranic commentary, which was just, the entire Quran, not just about the verses regarding the Jews. And there was really no difference in the glosses, in the interpretations, in that modern commentary, that quote unquote more mature commentary, because you could say, well, this was PhD thesis, maybe this was sort of a youthful, fanaticism that he outgrew, etc. No, it was exactly the same. It was also reaffirmed, and the reason that I felt it was so important is because no one can argue that this is Hamas, this is Hezbollah. This thesis went through, really, as it turns out, even just between the 2 editions, 30 years of reaffirmation through the most prestigious religious teaching institution in Sunni Islam. And it wasn't criticized. It wasn't, parts of it weren't, expunged or anything like that. No, it was simply reaffirmed. And when you have the discomfiture that both Atef, the translator, and myself experienced of going through the whole thing and sitting with it for a couple of years, you realize that again, it's not a reductio ad absurdum to say you compare this work. So our translation is 625 pages. The typical translation of the Hamas Covenant, if you look at Memories, if you look at some other academic translations, it's in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 pages in English, depending on how compulsively the translator footnotes it. So this is something that's roughly 60 times as long as the Hamas Covenant, and in its essence is very, very similar. And this is what I think is so disturbing but important, is that the Hamas Covenant is considered a very radical document, and it is certainly to non-Muslim standards. But this is equally radical, and the parallels are actually quite striking. If you look at essences, people are familiar now with the Hamas Covenant. Again, it's a short document. It focuses on the jihad of the entire global Muslim community, or Ummah, to destroy Israel as a political entity. And it also delves into, it literally cites this end of times, this eschatological hadith, which really is genocidal in the sense that it calls for the killing of the Jews en masse to usher in the Messianic age. Tantawi utilizes both of those themes. So the structure of the book is that it's 8 chapters, and then there is a conclusion, which is all about the quote unquote struggle for Palestine. And in that concluding chapter, which the 8 chapters build up to, it's exactly the same 2 keystones of the Hamas Covenant, which is a global jihad to destroy Israel as a political entity. And he certainly mentions the eschatological hadith, and the inference is, one must say, is the same that you would get from the Hamas Covenant. So that was very, very striking to me. Now, as in opposition to the Hamas Covenant, it's a much more the Islamic content, which is really the first 6.5 chapters, the purely Islamic content, is a much more academic and detailed analysis of Quran, of Quranic commentary, of traditions, comparing and contrasting them, and Tantawi drawing his own conclusions. There's nothing like that in the Hamas Covenant. And the other added element that goes beyond the Hamas Covenant, although there's a touch of it in the Hamas Covenant, is that foundation, that purely Islamic foundation, particularly a verse in the Quran, which Tantawi actually opens his whole work with, which is Quran 564, which talks about the Jews as sowing corruption. The whole foundation for these, and in some cases, Jonathan, they're really crack pottery. He adds these Western conspiratorial theories. I mean, some I never even heard of. Marcus Aurelius was prompted by Jews to slaughter Christians. The French Revolution, of course, is Jewish. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire is a Jewish conspiracy. There are all kinds of Jewish conspiracies that involve populations in France, Germany, Russia. William the Conqueror and the invasion of the Normans is a Jewish conspiracy. I mean, so there are
elements. That would have been news to him.
Yeah, exactly. There are elements here where it's just the crusade, the first crusade where Jews got slaughtered in the Rhineland. It's a Jewish conspiracy. So there is almost a lunatic aspect to some of this, at a certain stage. But you have to see that it's all based on these inveterate characteristics of the Jews that are developed over 6.5 chapters. And that too, Jonathan, is very important because it turns on its head this idea that, anti-Semitism in the Muslim world is somehow a virus that was inoculated by the West, as a result of the Crusades, as a result of missionary work. No, Tantawi makes very clear that they have their own tradition. Now, going back to its origins, are there overlaps between anti-Semitic themes in Christianity and Islam? Absolutely. But he is very proud of the fact that they don't need any other system to interpret Western manifestations of anti-Semitism, Western conspiratory theories. It's all in there for Muslims to see.
Yeah, I think, noting these crazy conspiracy theories, it kind of leads us to where your title, where you use the word Kampf, which is in this
Struggle. Yeah.
struggle, but
Yeah.
obviously
Obviously. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, I left out a important point here. He has these rationales / hagiographies of both Karl Marx, a virulent annihilationist anti-Semite, and Adolf Hitler. But again,
right.
it's explained. They are simply validating all the material that he has adduced that comes from Islam itself.
Right. Well, that is obviously to the point. The title, using the word Kampf in the title for this translation, does invoke the legacy of the Nazis. Given the importance of not labeling anything, we know the cost of the promiscuous use of inappropriate Nazi analogies, which is so prevalent in our society today, where anything we don't like is fascism or Nazism or Hitler. Why was it important to make this allusion to Hitler and his Mein Kampf with this book?
Yeah, part of it was perhaps juvenile. It was a good alliteration, but no, there was a
Fatal
serious.
temptation for a lot of writers, but yes.
It was, it is, but and I debated it honestly, Jonathan. But when I read the section on Hitler, and when I read the other thing, of course, is the protocols. I mean, the protocols are discussed at length. So 1966, 68 is the period when it's written and produced. I mean, in 1920 there was an extensive series. I don't mind looking up and reading and sitting back and studying things that I don't know about. And I did not know how early the protocols were debunked and how thoroughly. And there was actually a British journalist who had debunked the protocols and written an extensive, really brilliant series in the Times of London, I think in 1921. So it was available to Tantawi, for 40 plus years. That what are you talking about? I mean, this is patent nonsense. So I thought that ultimately the use of that term was not really too inflammatory. It was and there Jonathan, you have to remember there was a period when rumors circulated that Hitler had survived, and maybe he was living in South America, and even someone who became but more of a statesman, Anwar Sadat, wrote an infamous letter to Hitler, singing his praises in the 1950s and praying that he was still alive, to help the Arabs rid their region of the Jews. So it's pretty deep-seated in these cultures.
Let's take a dive for a minute into who the author of this book was and his venue, Hazr University. Why should we really care about them, and how widespread is the readership of this book that you've translated, which is obviously very shocking? Is this something that most imams would be with throughout the world?
They probably wouldn't read it, in its entirety, but so many sermons are using the interpretations that are accumulated within this book. That's the toxic part of it. As far as Tantawi himself, look, he had a prodigious memory. He was a hafiz, a Quran memorizer as a child. He had he worked his way through the education system. Was before he became Grand Imam, was actually the Mufti of Egypt for about 10 years. And I will say, Jonathan, there is quite a paradox to Tantawi. And remember, he was considered a moderate while he was alive, and there really were aspects. This is why it's just so unsettling in the end and disturbing, because there really were aspects where he was, you get a sense that he was reaching out for modernity, at least for Egyptian Muslims. His daughter was a physician and obviously wasn't held back from educational opportunities, and he was very proud of that fact. He was vehemently opposed to the niqab, the full face veil. He was opposed, and this was very progressive for Egypt, particularly the predominant school of Islamic law in Egypt is the Shafi'ite school. which is enthusiastic, I should say, for the practice of female genital mutilation. Tantawi came out against it. This earned him the ire of the real the Muslim Brotherhood itself and the Muslim Brotherhood types. So there was this paradox. On the other hand, the Muslim Brotherhood, in between the 1968 edition and the 1997 edition that we translated of his PhD thesis, the Muslim Brotherhood loved his PhD thesis, and they put out a version in the mid 1980s. So sort of a gangster version, and we didn't look at that. So it just shows you that there was this paradox. And his idea, when he met with Israel Me'alau in that infamous meeting in late 1997, he also reemphasized something that the Muslim Brotherhood adored, which was that he said very plainly that he rejected normalization with Israel. He openly rejected it, which is actually kind of a in a sense courageous things to do, because that was not the position of the government. And typically he abided by every position of the government. But that was such a popular sentiment, and he knew it, that he was unafraid to say that he rejected normalization of relations with Israel, and that enamored him to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Muslim Brotherhood types. So there was this paradox. There absolutely was a paradox. But the tragedy is that the Jew hatred, again, is Hamas level toxic Jew hatred. And that was unchanged throughout the course. As a matter of fact, while he was Grand Imam, he sanctioned homicide bombings against Jews in Israel, including after, not just before, after the horrible Netanya Passover massacre. He also, briefly at least, sanctioned homicide bombings against American troops in Iraq. And he openly would express this Qur'anic epithet, Quran 560, so the fifth surah, the 60th verse, that as the Jews as apes and pigs. There were definitely two sides to him.
Yeah, well, obviously, you can be a progressive in terms of modernity, but just want your modern Arab society to hate Jews just as much as
he clearly
traditional ones did. So there's that. Most in the West, including Jews, have no real understanding of the way Islam regards Jews and their historical status as dhimmi, or prescribed and discriminated against minority in Muslim societies. You have cited the work of the great historian of Jews under Islam, Bat Ye'or, as a major influence on you, but that is not reflected in the way most colleges and universities teach this subject, or part of the understanding of most Americans. There's a cost to that, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And I hate getting into some of these mudslinging things that go on, but it's not just, I'll put it to you this way, as diplomatically as I can. There is a disagreement amongst Jewish scholars that antedated Bat Ye'or, Jewish scholars that were her contemporaries and after her. And the position that she took, and she was my mentor, full disclosure, as was her husband, David Littman. So I guess I was biased in that direction, but I really wanted to learn things on my own. And she encouraged me, because she did not spend a lot of time getting into the theology of Islamic anti-Semitism per se, as opposed to the broader dhimmi condition. And she was, some of the discoveries that I made, she was actually quite somewhat surprised, not too surprised. But there were Jewish scholars like Moshe Perlman, like George Vajda, who was actually a Hungarian rabbi who spent his time in France. Vajda wrote a brilliant extended piece on the anti-Semitic traditions, so the anti-Semitism in the Hadith. And Moshe Perlman was really a scholar of the Muslim-Jewish polemic in the Middle Ages. But he made very clear in his PhD thesis that the Quranic anti-Semitism was very deep-seated, and it's a synopsis view, but it really provides validation, in a sense, of Tantawi. Obviously, Tantawi is much more extended, and relies so much more on the Quranic commentaries. But there have been doyens in the field that have literally argued that there is no theological anti-Semitism in Islam. And I just, for the last 25 years that I've accumulated my own understanding, that's not a tenable position. It just isn't. Even something as simple as what Muslims repeat 17 times a day. So there are supposed to be 5 prayer sessions. And then they're broken up into subdivisions. And overall, 17 times a day, a Muslim will repeat the first surah of the Quran. Very, very short surah called the Fatiha, literally the opening. So surahs 2 to 114. And this is why it's so difficult for people to read the Quran. It's so discursive and rambling. There's no chronological narrative. It's really longest to shortest. From Surah 2 to Surah 114. The major exception to that rule is the opening Fatiha, which is very short and only 7 verses. The 7th verse, which Muslims, again, repeat 17 times a day, talks about those that have engendered Allah's anger and those that have gone astray. And so it's a little bit elusive. But Muhammad makes very clear, and centuries of Qur'anic commentary make very clear, that it's the Jews who've engendered Allah's anger, and it's the Christians who've gone astray. And so for a devout Muslim to repeat that 17 times a day, that in and of itself has an indoctrinating effect. And that allusion to the Jews as having engendered Allah's anger is tied, certainly by the great commentators, to a whole range of verses that talk about curses upon the Jews for their perfidy, Jews as prophet killers, Jews just simply, the perfidiousness is manifested simply in their rejection of Muhammad and Islam. So it's very difficult for me to see how anyone could not understand the anti-Semitism that's inherent. There's an antichrist figure in Islam called the Dajjal, and that is in most of the traditions identified as being Jewish. Jews are responsible in Muslim historiography for the basic breach between Sunni and Shia, allegedly fomented by a renegade Yemenite Jew, and this is both an anti-Semitic and a racist motif because he's identified as, quote, son of a black woman. And he's responsible for from the Sunni perspective, for introducing the quote-unquote Shiite heresy. And then from the Shiite perspective, he's accused of introducing heresies into Shiism for which, Ali, the revered by Shiites, the fourth rightly guided caliph, had this renegade Yemenite Jew, Abdullah ibn Saba, burned to death. So these are profoundly anti-Semitic themes that permeate Islam. And Muhammad, the killing of prophets is actually, that's in the Quran, but in the traditions, Muhammad is allegedly poisoned to death as part of a Jewish conspiracy. So sort of this archetypal logic is extended in the Hadith. So it's very difficult for me to accept any longer the idea that there isn't significant theological anti-Semitism in Islam, and I was naive to all of it, but it's an accumulation of knowledge over the last 25 years.
Yeah, well, I think you demonstrated the roots of Muslim Jew hatred, are fairly deep, but many Islamists and certainly their left-wing non-Muslim allies claim that it's merely a function of their hostility to the modern state of Israel, but that isn't true, is it?
No, one of the things that really brought that home to me was this. It's just some of these things. You have to have a sense of humor, Jonathan, or you just can't go through this material after a while.
It is heavy going. Huh?
In the 9th century, I came across this. It was remarkable. So in the 9th century, Caliph al-Mutawakkil, who was a very pious Muslim ruler. There had been some experimental rulers before him, the Mutazilites, and his reign was they were defeated, and he was restoring orthodoxy to the seat of the caliphate in the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, and he was noticed because he had Christian enemies on his borders, the Armenian kingdoms, the Byzantine Empire certainly then, and he noticed something that disturbed him, that the Muslim population had harbored far more hatred towards the Jews. This is 9th century Iraq now, than they did towards the Christians. And he wanted to remedy what he saw as a geopolitical dangerous situation for Muslims.
Because the Jews weren't really a danger to Muslims.
Absolutely. They were crushed. They were dhimmi. They had no kingdom to rally support from, whereas these Christian populations did. So he hired the polymath of his era, Al-Jahiz, to write an anti-Christian tract to try and change this status quo. And what Jahiz noticed in researching, his task, he noticed his ruler was correct. In fact, the Muslim masses did, harbor much more hatred towards the Jews. And what he related it to was the quote unquote tumultuous relationship with Muhammad at the dawn of Islam, but also an anti-Semitic verse in the Quran, Quran 582, which claims that the Jews harbor the greatest hostility towards the Muslims. And I also found, just by chance, there was a Sufi that was a contemporary of Al-Jahiz, and he too noticed the same thing, only he thought that it was really the tumultuous relationship with Muhammad, and that this Quranic verse, Quran 582, was secondary. So there you have it, in a society, far removed from Western society, this phenomenon rooted in Islam of hatred towards Jews, even when they're disempowered dhimmi. And it just brought home to me that, yes, there are elements of Western anti-Semitism, elements that are certainly prevalent now. But to say that it was a virus from the West that infected Islam, which was pristine in terms of anti-Semitism, I just think is an untenable hypothesis.
Yeah, it's ahistorical. Well, drilling down into this volume, what would you say are the most shocking, or some of the most shocking or revelatory passages about the anti-Semitism that it contains?
Yeah, I would just say it's more broadly the idea that the conspiratorial Jew hatred that is of an Islamic basis is now used by this. Now we have to caveat would be he's not exactly a historian of the West, but it's used to rationalize every possible conspiratorial Jew-hating theory that is of Western origin. And I think that, to me, that was the most shocking thing about it. And really, it did not come out in the extracts that I had way back in 2008 that went into the legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism. I never would have appreciated that without having the entire work translated and then reading it in the language where I can understand it in English and going through it again and again and again. That was the most shocking thing to me. I don't think that his interpretations of some of these, nothing in his interpretations of these Quranic verses was particularly new. And in fact, he makes very clear, and I go through this at some length, which is why even my introduction was so long. He's using the classical commentators, and he may have subtle disagreements with them at certain times, but in terms of their basic interpretations of the main anti-Semitic themes in the Quran, he's in lockstep agreement with them. And that's actually very important too, because I do point out that there was an British academic, without citing any evidence, by the way, who claimed that he had gone against the traditional Quranic commentators, the classical Quranic commentators, and then she mentioned one modern Quranic commentary. And I just have to say, Jonathan, when I juxtaposed the writings in the thesis, but also remember, he has his own more mature commentary, and I juxtaposed these verses with the classical commentators like Zamakhshari, Badawi, Ibn Kathir, etc. There's nothing significantly different about them. There may be differences, like there's a series of verses in the 17th surah about and they talk about the Israel's punishment for transgressing the will of Allah, for corruption, etc. And there's some historical debate. Well, was it Nebuchadnezzar? Was it Titus? So there's some discussion of who, because the idea is that they will be punished 2 times or 3 times for their transgressions. And some of the historical figures that the commentators allude to can differ, but the idea that they're going to be punished for transgression is the same. And so I just didn't find that criticism valid. And of course, this particular scholar gave no examples of it. She just sort of made the statement. So I thought that was an important point to make, is that no, he's very consistent, unfortunately, with classical and modern commentary. And actually, I pointed to some modern commentators on that particular verse. It was really Quran 17:4-8, and one of them was a Sunni, who was former Grand Imam, Grand Mufti of Pakistan, and this was a more modern interpretation. So it was related to the jihad against Israel, and it was very explicit in this modern Pakistani commentary. And then more broadly, in terms of the jihad against Jews and Christians, which comes out of the 9th surah, the 29th verse, and that's where the dimma comes from as well. I looked at Tabatabai, who was he's considered a theosopher. So like this neologism. He wasn't just a theologian. He wasn't just a philosopher. He was a theosopher. And the largest social sciences university in Iran is named after him, Allama, which is the highest honorific for a jurist, Allama Tabatabai University. Well, his gloss on Quran 929, I compared to Tantawi's gloss on Quran 929 in Tantawi's mature thesis. They're virtually identical. And unfortunately, they extend this idea of a jihad to submit Jews and Christians into the modern era. There's no other way to interpret it, because after all, as Tabatabai puts it explicitly, the lunacies and the improprieties of these non-Muslims makes it impossible to allow them to govern states in the ideal order.
Yeah, I think you've alluded to this before, of accusations of cherry-picking quotes out of a Muslim text, and that's why you decided to translate this entire book. And certainly critics will say that this is this different from what anti-Semites like Candace Owens do when she tries to quote from the Talmud, something she clearly has no real understanding of, to justify.
Gee, Jonathan, I sure hope it is.
Yeah. But I guess the devil's advocate here would be to say that, can we do this exercise with any religious text or even modern commentaries about them? Or is this something that is really very specifically anti-Semitic that just can't be denied?
Well, I guess there's 2 ways to answer that. First of all, there's no way to claim that Tantawi's interpretations are somehow aberrant, the way this one academic, to a certain extent, was trying to slip in there. Again, you just have to go through the commentaries, not only that he cites, but there are others, of course, that he doesn't cite, that are in lockstep agreement. So there's really no cherry picking to be found. However, when you look at, so for example, there are profoundly anti-Semitic writings, I'm sure you're familiar with, that come from the church fathers, that come from men like Luther, etc. But one trend and by the way, Tantawi was very upset with this trend. He actually referred to, in his offhand way, again, the history of Western societies is not one of his strengths, but he was alluding to the process which would be analogous to Vatican II. And the coming to terms, for example, with the deicide allegation. He's apoplectic about that process, Tantawi. He hates it with a passion. And how dare, because it defies the Islamic conception, which is that the Jews didn't really kill Jesus, by the way, in Islam, but they wanted to, and they certainly killed his body double. Allah had sucked him out of his abode and replaced him with a body double, and the perfidious Jews went ahead and killed the body double. And there's a whole other theology we don't have to get into about where Jesus is and when he comes back as a pious Muslim. But regardless, so Tantawi was outraged with that. But it does draw the contrast, which is that, despite this ugly legacy of theological Christian anti-Semitism, there has been an attempt. It's ongoing. You can call it inchoate. It's still, but there was a Vatican II Nostra Aetate. The deicide allegation was at least formally rejected. Now, there are those, and you mentioned one, like Candace Owens, who I'm sure would be thrilled to bring it back, and is probably trying to do so. But I think that's also an important distinction to make. And again, one of the reasons that I wrote this book, the more mundane reason, was to simply have Jewish organizations criticize Al-Azhar. I'm not expecting them to launch their own Vatican II anytime soon. But, when Deborah Lipstadt goes to Cairo and engages in some, feel-good nonsense about the restoration of an old Cairo synagogue, yet doesn't go to meet with Ahmed al-Tayeb, Tantawi's successor, who is just as virulent an anti-Semite as Tantawi, and doesn't sit down with him and lay down the law and say, you've got to stop giving these anti-Semitic sermons. Tayeb, the current Grand Imam, twice on national Egyptian television has gone through a detailed discussion of this verse I mentioned earlier in that period in Baghdad, Quran 582, which, again, the Jews harbor the greatest animosity towards the Muslims. And he has said twice on national television, current Grand Imam Tayeb, that defines the relationship for 1,400 years between Muslims and Jews on national television. That's what he's teaching his flock, which is the Egyptian population. And not to mention all the anti-Semitism that has poured out of Al-Azhar. We didn't even mention this, Jonathan, since October 7th, 2023. The day of, when the body count was still rising, it was only 600 at the time or so, and Al-Azhar issued a statement celebrating the, quote, heroic resistance of the Palestinians. No mention whatsoever of the carnage they were inflicting. And then about 10 days later, a formal fatwa was issued, which declared that the lives of all Israelis, since so many serve in the IDF, were legitimate targets of jihad. And this piggybacked onto fatwas like this, which literally go back to the partition plan in 1947. So I think it's important to see some of these differences, to see the continuum. I'm not an apologist for Christian anti-Semitism, but we see some effort to repudiate this theology, and we don't see it in Islam. Certainly, we don't see it in a mea culpa fashion, other than just there are certain quarters that will deny it exists, and to me that's not the same as saying here it is. Let's look at the commentaries, because we can't change the text, but we can change the commentaries and offer all kinds of new interpretations of these verses. I don't see anything that acknowledges the existing body of anti-Semitism in Islam and says, here are the measures that we're going to take to correct it. I just see, well, it doesn't really exist, so let's just turn to something else.
Right. Well, certainly Muslims and their allies have been successful in covering up the way their institutions and religious leaders have promoted Jew hatred. Certainly, it's also true that Jews, eager as they always are to make allies in other communities, and by that I mean the Jewish establishment, liberal Jewish organizations, and historians, and former federal officials like Deborah Lipstadt that you just referenced, they're eager to make allies in other communities and to project their own attitudes on others. But as you said, other religions have evolved and changed over the centuries and undergone reformations and transformations. Why hasn't Islam? And is it possible for there to be a reformation that will eventually allow Islam to truly be, as its apologists claim, a religion of peace, at least as far as Jews are concerned?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think there are huge obstacles. It depends on the investment that the Muslims are willing to make. It also depends, I think, simple things, Jonathan. You and I both follow the Middle East Media Research Institute and the reports that they put out. There are simple steps that non-Muslims, particularly Jews in this case, but I think Christians as well, because there's plenty of anti-Christian sermons across the world, I think that the simple act of saying, with every memory report that comes out, and you don't have to just rely entirely on memory. I mean, they shouldn't shoulder the entire burden. But if there would be a press release every time one of these virulently anti-Semitic sermons comes out, not a press release, once every 2 or 3 or 5 years when something particularly heinous is preached at a mosque, but the monotony of doing this every single week, because every single week there's an example. If that was exposed and condemned, I think the weight of that kind of evidence, might actually move the situation in a positive direction. And it's a very simple, inexpensive thing to do. It just requires some discipline and the willingness, to invest in the effort. And then, of course, I think that should be combined with quote unquote confrontations, but certainly meetings with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, with, the Saudis are now preaching anti-Semitic sermons again out of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And just the Jewish community and other faiths, Christian community, have to have the courage to say, no, don't do this. Stop doing this. We won't accept this. We won't accept you at interfaith dialogue meetings if you're gonna preach this way. Just stop it. We're aware of it. Stop it. It's ugly. Don't do it. That should be the bare minimum step that's going on. I don't see that either.
Yeah, well, I think the imperative to speak up is vital. It's what you've been doing. Andrew Bostom, thanks so much for joining us today. How can our audience find out more about your writing and follow your work?
So I'm active on Twitter X at Andrew Bostom. And then my website is www.andrewbostom.net. And those of my books that are still in print, I'm trying to remedy some of that too, are all available at Amazon.
Well, great. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which you can hear wherever you get your podcasts. And whether you're listening to us on one of them or watching us live on Facebook or X or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.